Hey guys, the current health of Space Marine 2's player base has been a hotly debated topic online. I wanted to do a little research and see how Space Marine is doing 6 months out from the launch date compared to other PvE Horde games that have come out in the past. The games that we're going to be using for this comparison are the following: Space Marine 2, Helldivers 2, Darktide, Back 4 Blood, Deep Rock Galactic, Left 4 Dead 2, World War Z, and Vermintide 2. First of all, Steam is the only platform that is completely transparent about the player data, so these numbers don't reflect console players, but it does still give us a good idea of the trends with the player base. What I've done here is adjust the graph to picture the first 6 months from launch for all the games. It's also important to note that Vermintide 2 launched March 3rd, 2018, but didn't come out on Xbox until July 2018 and came to PlayStation December 18th, 2018. So the number of PC players was probably a little bit higher because it wasn't available on console during that period. Darktide also launched only on PC November 30th, 2022, but didn't come to Xbox until October 4th, 2023, and it just made it to PS5 on December 3rd, 2024. Darktide also launched day one on Game Pass for PC, which probably resulted in a 20 to 30% more overall players than what we're seeing on Steam. Just things to keep in mind, although I think we can safely assume that the Steam charts will still give us a good comparison. And if I left out your favorite Horde game, leave it down in the comments and show it some love. One last quick note: take this presentation with a grain of salt. It's possible that I missed something, and if you see anything important that I missed, feel free to leave it down in the comments. I won't be offended and will pin it if it's significant. Alright, so the too long didn't read version of this video, to respect your guys' time, is that Space Marine 2 has held on to the least amount of players of all 8 games in comparison to its number of players at launch. However, the actual number of remaining players of 9,820 as of the day I gathered the data puts it at 3rd place out of 8. And most of these games continue to receive significant updates for at least a couple years after launch. So although Saber has not done a great job at holding on to the player base, they have enough players to warrant continued updates to the game and not abandoning it. Some of the games on the list have had huge resurgences in the player base after big updates, but had long periods where only a few thousand hardcore fans were playing the game. What's most likely gonna happen with Space Marine is that it'll drop down to about 3,000 to 5,000 players on Steam, and depending on how the next updates go, we could see it bounce back up anywhere between 15,000 to 50,000 at times. As long as the peak players don't drop below 2,000 or 3,000, I'm sure the game will continue to receive updates for at least a couple years. But it does seem that Saber's putting a significant portion of their resources into other games, so the updates may be slower and less content rich than the hardcore players were hoping for. I know for sure that Saber is developing a Turok game, and they're definitely putting a significant amount of their resources into that. Alright, during the making of this video, the community event for the Imperial Vigil helmet launched, and on Saturday, February 22nd, the Space Marine 2 players jumped back up to 14,115 at the peak amount, so that would bring the player base to 6.25% and put it in 7th place for whatever that's worth. Now, if you guys are curious about the breakdown of the player numbers for the other games, stay and watch the rest of the video with me and we'll go through that along with some other interesting facts. So we can see here that Space Marine 2 launched at 225,690 players, and 6 months later we're at a peak of 9,820 for the day. That's 4.3% of the original player base, or or 6.25% based on Saturday's data. And here we can see that Helldivers 2 launched with 155,000, but quickly jumped up to 458,000 players within a couple weeks. Since the peak player base jumped up so close to launch, I used the 458,000 so we could get a more accurate representation of the decline. At the 6-month mark, Helldivers 2 had dropped down to 26,362 players, which is 5.7%. I think that Helldivers 2 is the only game that's basically a live service model with new battle passes and packs to buy frequently. Darktide. For Darktide, the players quickly jumped up to 108,000 within a few days after launch, so we'll be using that as our starting number. At the 6-month mark, it dropped down to 8,244, which is 7.6% of the original player base. Deep Rock Galactic. I haven't played Deep Rock personally, but a Deep Rock player never misses the chance to say how great Deep Rock is down in the comments, so don't forget to do that if you're a Deep Rock player. Now, Deep Rock launched at 4,067 players and dropped down to 1,311 by the 6-month mark, which is 32.23% of the original player base. Deep Rock saw a huge resurgence in players later in its life, but we'll go over that later in the video. Left 4 Dead 2 is known by many as the gold standard in the PvE Horde genre. It launched at 22,746 players and dropped down to 14,697 by the 6-month mark, which is 64% of the original player base. It didn't even reach its peak players until a full 2 years after launch, when it jumped up to 162,000. That's uncommon, but just shows anything can happen. World War Z, Saber Interactive's previous game, quickly rose to 6,714 players a few days after launch and dropped down to 5,134 players at the 6-month mark, holding on to a staggering 76.46% of the launch players. Vermintide 2, one of my favorite games of all time, quickly rose to 73,316 players at launch and dropped down to 7,271 players at the 6-month mark, which is 9.9% of the original player base. Vermintide 2 hit its all-time peak players of 104,000 a full 4 years after launch due to the free-to-keep event where they gave the game out free for a short period. It very quickly dropped back down to 8,000 average players, but it was around 3,000 to 4,000 average before the event, so they effectively doubled their remaining player base 4 years into the game's lifespan, so that's pretty damn good. Back 4 Blood quickly rose to 65,987 players just 4 days after launch and declined to 8,888 players at the 6-month mark, which is 13.46% of the player base. Back 4 Blood was also available for free on day 1 on Game Pass PC subscribers, so we have to assume that there was also an extra at least 20 to 30% of the player base on there as well. What keeps PvE Horde games alive? PvE Horde games that have had a long life span in the past tend to have regular updates from the developers. Some of the most successful PvE Horde games like Deep Rock Galactic, which as you can see here, it actually continued to grow in player base well past the 6-month mark, and it did so by having a reputation of the developers listening to the community, being welcoming with mod support, and having frequent free and paid updates to the game. And the same basically goes for Left 4 Dead 2. Valve continued to frequently update the game, and there was a massive overhaul of the game 10 years after its launch called The Last Stand, which introduced many updates to the game and improvements. Left 4 Dead 2 is also known for its community mods, and it had a lot of community mods and support throughout the years. Now, you might say that Space Marine 2 2 gets updated about once a month, right? That's about how often we've been getting our patch updates, but I would argue that introducing a skin and some minor balance tweaks is a very minuscule update, and this is probably why the game has struggled to hold on to more of its players. Deep Rock Galactic also had a strong community mod support through the Steam Workshop, and Left 4 Dead 2 biggest expansion, The Last Stand, was originally a fan-made mod that was later officially released by Valve. I've mentioned in the past that I wasn't the biggest fan of mods in Space Marine 2 because they can hurt the integrity of the game by allowing players to easily make themselves overpowered and making it difficult for non-modded players to enjoy playing with modded players. Also, for the hardcore players doing challenge runs like solo absolute or true solo absolute, it can quickly get tricky because those runs wouldn't be as credible if a modded weapon was being used, or there were other gameplay affecting mods, or using certain mods to make it easier while hiding it. Maybe in the future, Saber could introduce a modded lobby for the game where mods can still be online for anyone, but in special modded lobbies. Maybe this would split the player base, but it could also bring a lot of new players into the game if the game has a good reputation overall, so maybe it wouldn't be an issue. As we can see in this chart here, Left 4 Dead 2's all-time peak players happened in December 2013, 4 years after its November 2009 launch. This was due to the game going on a massive Steam sale down to $1. These kind of practices can help bring in new players, and if they like the game, they'll buy DLC packs, which keeps profits flowing in for the game. But you wouldn't want to do something like that until quite a while after release, because you'd be losing all the potential profit from the game sale price. Here in this chart, we can see Deep Rock Galactic had big jumps in players years after launch through free weekends, which can still be a financially viable strategy if you have compelling DLC packs. Deep Rock also took the approach of having cosmetic only DLC, similar to how Space Marine does it, but the weapon skins and armor sets in Deep Rock were compelling enough to have players wanting to buy. So we can see from other successful games in the genre that there are different options that Space Marine 2 can steer its current course towards. It can speed up content a little, open a Steam Workshop, supported mods, online lobby, start doing discounts and free weekends, or do a paid DLC that offers a lot more playable content. Closing thoughts. So overall, it's clear that Space Marine 2's done a poor job at holding on to its percentage of players relative to its peak at launch. But since the original amount of players was so high at 225,000, there's still a lot of players left compared to where other games were at the 6-month mark, and the developers have more than enough reason to continue supporting the game. The game is certainly not dead, and I think a good idea would be to increase the manpower currently working on the game just a little bit and start working on a big paid update to the game. Even though I bought the deluxe early access edition at launch for like $90, I wouldn't mind paying another $10 if it meant we could get a big content drop in a timely manner, but it needs to be things that you can actually play and not just cosmetics. And I do realize that a lot of players wouldn't be open to DLC that was non-cosmetic because players end up feeling like the items that you can pay for, even if it's supposed to be balanced with the other weapons, ultimately you know there would be some people saying like, oh, that DLC weapon is stronger than the other ones and it's pay to win now, so that can open up a whole new can of worms. And I think Saber has specifically said in the past that they don't want to go down that route, and even if it was just like another level or a different game mode in the paid DLC, I know a lot of players would still be opposed to that, but just for me personally, if it meant that Saber would be more willing to put more resources back into the game and put a couple more developers back on, the development team for Space Marine, I would be willing to cough up a few more bucks, for a couple more DLCs. But I do understand that a lot of players are not open to that at all, which is totally reasonable. I'm just kind of impatient. But there's still other routes that the game can go, with opening up more mod support or other things. And I know it kind of sounded like I was trashing mods earlier, but I do like mods in other games, and I'm open to playing modded stuff in Space Marine 2 if I can easily switch between like modded and non-modded gameplay. That way I can still do like my solo runs in non-modded and get credit for those being legit, and then when I'm bored of regular gameplay I can hop over to some modded lobbies. I played games in the past, like, I think Warcraft 3 was the first game that I played that had really good mod support, and that was the first time I played Dota when it was still Dota All-Stars in the Warcraft 3 engine. So there's a lot of great things that can spring out of modded lobbies. So I'm definitely not opposed to mods, but I just want there to be an option for the original gameplay to be left alone. And that's how classically Darktide and Vermintide have kind of handled it. They don't really allow any kind of mods that affect gameplay to a significant degree. They'll allow like some mods to the HUD or different like cosmetic mods, but nothing like new weapons or abilities or anything like that, because it can start getting real funky with the balancing of the game and players just like basically cheating. So that's why you want modded lobbies in general. What do you guys think about the current state of Space Marine 2? Do you plan on sticking with it for a while longer, or do you plan to jump ship soon? If any significant updates to Space Marine happen soon in the future, I'll be keeping my eye on that, so look out for an update video from me in the future. As a closing note, this video took me quite a few hours to do some reading up on things and putting together the graphs, so it would help me a ton if you guys dropped a like on the video. And if you guys have been enjoying the content and you're not subscribed, consider subscribing. Thanks. Also, thank you guys so much. We just hit 500 subscribers recently, and I became eligible to apply for the YouTube Partner Program. So I'm able to do channel memberships and live streaming tips now. So if there's anything you guys would like to see with the channel memberships, like behind the scenes access on the making of the videos, I know, some of the YouTubers I watch do that kind of content, and it really helped me, kind of like get a direction with my own content. So maybe I could do something like that, or early access to my videos, or maybe just like less edited scripted videos that I could put out a little more easily and just make those for members only. Some of my favorite content creators do that as well. So if you guys are interested in anything like that, let me know. But just thank you so much for the 500 subs. I really appreciate you guys, and especially, you frequent flyers that keep coming back and commenting and interacting and stuff. I do recognize you guys from video to video, so it's cool to see like a little community starting to form.